The last days of Frederick II, the emperor, rotted away alive, surrounded by doctors and hawks. 13th century, Holy Roman Empire. In a dark stone room, where even the fire in the hearth seemed damp, there was a smell of rotting flesh, vinegar, and egg yolk. One of the servants later wrote, "We entered with cloths over our mouths. His breath was decomposing before our eyes. He was already a dead man who could still speak. Emperor Frederick, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, conqueror, builder, philosopher, hunter, and apostate, lay on a stone bed surrounded by pillows and furs, but the cold had already filled his body. Hawks stood around him, perched on their posts in the chambers, a remnant of his former passion for falconry. Now the birds only fidgeted anxiously, sensing the smell of death. The emperor fell ill in early November at Castelfiorentino on the border of Apulia. At first, he felt weak, heavy in the stomach, and constantly dizzy. Later, he developed a fever, and pus began to ooze from his groin and anus. The doctors diagnosed it as an internal abscess caused by excessive mental and physical strain. Bloodletting began. Twice a day, his veins were cut with a sharp knife on his wrists, which had been warmed with rags to make the blood flow more freely. The veins were reluctant to open, and instead of healthy dark blood, a thick, foul-smelling liquid flowed from Friedrich's body. His pulse is uneven, his breath foul, his urine cloudy and fatty, his mind clouded. The emperor asks, "Have I already been poisoned? How many days do I have left?" wrote one of the court physicians, a monk named Thomas of Spoleto. He prescribed an ointment made from goat bile and crushed wine mixed with vinegar, which was rubbed on the thighs, where necrotic changes in the skin had already begun. His flesh was blackened with spots, like the victims of the plague, although the plague had not yet reached southern Italy that year. The servants began to wear masks made of rags soaked in vinegar and honey. One of the servants, Augustine, later reported that, by morning it was impossible to stay in the room without vomiting. He could no longer stand up, but called for the alchemist, then the falconer, then demanded books on signs from the sky. He believed that the disease was caused by the planets, but at the same time accused the Jews of witchcraft and demanded the execution of the cook. The alchemist Abramo from Salerno brought decoctions of arsenic, ash, and dried sparrow liver infused with honey and alcohol. These potions caused the emperor to hallucinate. He claimed to have seen a black monk sitting at the foot of his bed and ordered the guards to board up all the windows with iron bars. In his sleep, he called out to his dead mother and, according to his servants, whispered curses in Latin, although no one could tell whether he was actually speaking or mumbling through his decaying tongue. The court astrologer refused to enter the chambers. In a letter to the Archbishop of Taranto, he wrote, "The time of his birth coincided with the ascension of Saturn in a destructive degree. To die at the conjunction of two black stars is a sign of punishment. I will not enter." Of the 9 court physicians, only 3 remained. 1 died of fever, and 2 fled during the night, not waiting for punishment for their ineffective remedies. Access to the body was strictly limited. Guards stood at the entrance and only allowed people in after they had signed a register. The heir, Conrad, did not come, but sent reports. The German nobility, who had previously gathered in Apulia, dispersed. Only maids were allowed into the chambers to change the linen, which was burned every evening. The fabric taken from the bed hissed as if it had been soaked in acid. The skin on his feet began to crack. Under his armpits were green-rimmed sores from which a worm-like mass emerged. One of the doctors, named Giovanni, opened the wounds with a red-hot iron. The emperor did not cry out. He just stared at the ceiling and said once, "If this is hell, why am I still alive?" He could no longer write, but he dictated orders to his secretary, demanding that the bishops excommunicate those who had left his court. He declared that he would burn alive anyone who mentioned him as a heretic and ordered that the gold be buried in the castle garden. Legend has it that he asked a hawk, an old male with a broken wing, to remain on his chest after his death. By mid-December, he began to have convulsions. He could no longer recognize those around him. His secretary wrote in his diary, "He thought he was talking to his long-dead father. He called for St. Paul and once ordered that a dwarf, whom he mistook for the devil, be chained up. The dwarf was beaten and died in prison. Friedrich's body temperature rose to a feverish state. His urine turned black with a sediment and smelled of tar and vinegar. Doctors diagnosed gangrene spreading throughout the lower half of his body. In his last days, his chest wheezed like a broken blacksmith's bellows. His face turned black, his eyes sunken. One cheek began to decay while he was still alive. He asked for a mirror, but when he saw his reflection, he struck it with his hand. The shards cut his palm, from which thick black pus flowed instead of blood. The testimony of Madalena, a servant, reads, "On the third day before his death, he called for a priest, but then spat on the floor and said, 'Where was your God when death bit me? He died at dawn. No one knows the exact hour.' The deceased lay with his mouth open, his fingers crooked, and his skin resembling that of a decomposing dog. They immediately began to wash his body, but his fingers were already dead. His nails fell off, and his eye sockets turned black. Spices, vinegar, resin, and thick fabrics were used for embalming. It is recorded that during the first 2 hours, the body emitted such a stench that 3 soldiers went out into the courtyard, fell down, and began vomiting blood. The castle was locked for 3 days. Officially, this was to complete the embalming. In reality, it was to hide the extent of the decomposition. When the body was carried out, liquid dripped from under the shroud. It was said that his heart had already burst. Servants carried him on long poles so as not to touch him with their hands. After Frederick's death, riots broke out in northern Italy. His heir, Conrad, refused to go south, and the Bishop of Palermo declared that he did not recognize the emperor's will. The gold buried in the garden was never found. For several weeks, rumors circulated that Frederick was alive, that he had gone to the Saracens and was preparing his return. The people believed that he was immortal, like an ancient hero, and that the dead man shown in the coffin was a substitute. The church rejoiced. The Pope officially announced that the enemy of God had received his just punishment and ordered 3 days of solemn prayers in Rome. However, leaflets appeared among the people saying, "If the enemy of God took so long to die, what awaits us if we sin even by a hair?" The empire was shaken. 3 different pretenders contested the throne. The southern lands rebelled. Massacres of Jews accused of poisoning the water, wells, and wine began. Frederick's corpse in the mausoleum in Salerno was surrounded by an iron grate to prevent him from rising again. A later medical treatise found in a monastery in Monte Cassino explained the emperor's death as advanced intestinal gangrene with systemic putrefactive fever caused by a chronic infection. The author added, "But if the decay began during his lifetime, it may not have been solely physical." Decay did not stop with death. 2 days after his last breath, Friedrich's body began to swell. His chest cracked along the seam sewn by a local embalmer, and a liquid saturated with decay flowed onto the stone floor. Not all of his internal organs remained inside. His heart had been removed, but his liver and part of his intestines had been left behind through negligence. The doctors argued. Some said it was dangerous to remove everything. Others said it was too late. The stench was so bad that even the guards were changed every 2 hours. The body was smeared with hot resin mixed with cinnamon, ash water, and chicken fat. Layers of waxed cloth were placed on top and fumigated with a mixture of incense and bone dust. One of the servants, Nikolai, wrote in his report, "We did not cover the face with cloth, but poured oil over it. The eyes burst and the teeth came out through the rotten lips. It was no longer a human being." While attempts were being made to prepare the body for public viewing, the struggle for the throne was raging. Conrad, the son from the second marriage, refused to go to Salerno, fearing for his life. He feared a conspiracy, and not without reason. A letter from the Archbishop of Mainz contains the phrase, "A dead lion is not to be feared, but his claws are still embedded in people." His half-brother Enzo, imprisoned in Bologna, sent word through a bribed monk that he recognized himself as the heir and demanded his immediate release. At the same time, rumors spread in Apulia that the death was unnatural. The Bishop of Trani secretly sent letters stating, "Frederick did not die of decay, but of poison mixed into his wine by a Saracen apothecary. The same man disappeared on the night before his death." The body continued to be guarded. At night, two men tried to break into the chambers on the orders of the archivist, who wanted to retrieve personal papers. One was captured, the other was killed on the spot. Even in death, the emperor continued to inspire fear. While the rotting body was kept under a veil of lies and resin, the political machine was collapsing. Letters arrived from Germany from princes who did not want to recognize either Conrad or the other pretenders. One of the nobles, Otto von Landsberg, wrote, "Frederick was cursed, and the land that gave birth to him will be without an heir." Unrest swept through the cities. Craftsmen refused to pay taxes, accusing the local nobility of God's wrath, sent for supporting a heretic. In the last days of his life, as it later became known, the emperor signed a mysterious document in which he transferred part of his powers not to Conrad, but to the Saracen Jacob, a former advisor on alchemy. Attempts were made to burn this document, but one of the clerks kept a copy. It was found a year later in the basement of Bari Cathedral. The decree stated, "Let my will be done, and the treasure be hidden, according to the words of the stars." This document was recognized as a forgery, but its existence fueled rumors that the emperor believed in astrology rather than God until his death. The servants who cared for him were interrogated. Many disappeared or died of strange diseases. Only one, an old eunuch from Palermo, spoke his mind. He died like a cursed man. His flesh stank, his breath shook the walls, and even the birds flew away from the tower where he lay. The funeral took place at night, attended by only a few people. The coffin was heavy, filled with lead and resin. On the way to the mausoleum, it slipped off the cart twice. One of the horses collapsed and did not get up. At the entrance to the tomb, the body was dropped. Whether this was accidental or intentional, no one admitted. The servants were silent. The priest turned pale. There was no farewell. People did not go to the coffin, did not throw flowers. They only sprinkled vinegar around the space. Meanwhile, in the Papal States, there was wild rejoicing. The Pope, who had previously declared Frederick a heretic, sent out letters with the phrase, "The plague in the Iron Crown has fallen. Now we can breathe." But fear remained. Over the next few weeks, monasteries throughout Italy reported cases of mass exhaustion, refusal to eat, and self-flagellation. People feared that the emperor's death would trigger a chain of curses. Stories spread throughout Germany and Italy. It was said that the emperor had risen from the dead and was wandering through the forests in a black robe. In Naples, a monk claimed to have seen a body in chains walking through the streets at night, emitting steam. In Apulia, a legend arose that the coffin was empty, that the body had disappeared and would be found when evil rose again. It was easier to believe this than to admit that the king had died in filth and loneliness. Struggles began within the empire. Feudal lords raised armies against each other, and cities declared themselves independent. Conrad tried to hold on to power, but he was feared like the ghost of his father. The bishops refused to crown him, citing the blood of defilement that remained from Frederick's body. Several princes left the Roman Curia, accusing the Pope of poisoning the emperor. A new wave of massacres of Saracens, Jews, and doctors began. Friedrich's ashes did not rest in peace. A month after the burial, the mausoleum was opened, allegedly for inspection. The archives did not preserve the exact document, but letters from two witnesses confirm that only a tar cocoon and a stain on the stone remained of the body. The head was separate, the skin was falling off, and the smell was so bad that one of the soldiers died. The remains were sealed again, locked up, and surrounded by crosses. But it was too late. The emperor's death did not bring order, but decay, not physical, but political. His flesh rotted away, but the fear of him remained within the walls. And even years later, when a new ruler entered that very castle, his courtier, according to legend, fainted at the sight of a black feather accidentally left on the throne. It was the feather of a hawk that had once sat at the feet of the dying emperor. I continue with the third part of the story, in the same dry documentary style. The narrative remains consistent, revealing new details. The aftermath of death, echoes of fear, religious and political decay, the struggle for power, the return of rumors, the removal of the body, new victims, and the emergence of cult followers. Everything is woven into the chronology as a single, unbroken chronicle. 3 months after the emperor's death, the smell in the chambers of Castelfiorentino had not disappeared. Servants reported that even after the body had been removed, after the walls had been cleaned several times and the furniture replaced, a sour smell reminiscent of rotting meat seeped from under the stone floor at night. The Archbishop of Taranto ordered a ritual, cleansing of the place. 2 old monks were brought in, who spent the whole night reading psalms and fumigating the halls with incense and sulphur. One of them died the next morning from pulmonary edema. The second went deaf. The city guard's reports recorded cases where residents of nearby villages refused to approach the castle. One farmer claimed that at night he could hear flapping wings in the tower. There were no birds there. The castle remained empty. None of the heirs settled there. It became a place that even pilgrims' carriages avoided. Meanwhile, in Naples, on Conrad's orders, the deceased's papers were confiscated. Among them were dozens of encrypted texts, recipes, calculations based on the phases of the moon, sketches of an elixir of invulnerability, and letters to unknown persons signed only with the words, "I am Caesar of the future." One of the documents sent to Palermo contained a list of 62 names. 4 of them were dead during the emperor's lifetime. The rest were killed within a year of his death. All were connected with alchemical or astrological affairs at court. Of the 7 servants who were present at the emperor's death, only 2 survived. One was Guido, a shoemaker who fled to Genoa. The second, Ulrich, a former squire, was found dead in a monastery in Benevento. A piece of cloth, supposedly sewn from the emperor's blanket, was found in his throat. According to the monastery's medical records, his entrails were black as earth and smelled of sulphur. The priest refused to bury the body, and it was burned without ceremony. Panic ensued. Rumors spread throughout Apulia that Frederick had become the lord of the dead, that his soul had not gone to God but remained in the palace. Pilgrims appeared in Salerno. Men in black hoods who remained silent during the day and lit fires in front of the tomb at night. Priests burned several such groups as heretics. One of them, captured in Acca, claimed during interrogation, "We do not pray to Frederick. We fear him. He will return to take those who betrayed his body." At the same time, Conrad issued a decree that any mention of alchemy at court was punishable by death. This caused a split among the former courtiers. Those who had been involved in alchemy and astrology under Frederick began to disappear. Some found refuge in monasteries in Sicily. There, secret meetings began to form, essentially sects that claimed that Frederick's flesh had not died, but had been transformed. They believed that his illness was a test, and his death a transformation. At that time, the Pope issued a separate bull prohibiting anyone from being buried within 100 steps of Frederick's mausoleum. It was declared, "His death is not the end, but an open wound. Until his ashes are destroyed, rot will spread throughout the Christian world." Several ambassadors from Germany demanded that Conrad reburial the body. He refused. In Rome, open sermons began against the contagious influence of the late emperor. One of the preachers, Brother Felix, claimed that he had seen a dream in which Frederick's coffin burst open and smoke came out of it, turning the whole city to ashes. He was burned for heresy, but the crowds only grew. In southern Italy, monasteries began to surround themselves with stone walls to keep out the possessed. In May of the year following his death, a secret exhumation of the mausoleum was carried out. According to the official version, this was done to strengthen the foundation. In reality, it was to make sure that the body was still in the coffin. 7 people were present: 3 clergymen, 2 soldiers, a secretary, and Conrad himself. The secretary, whose notes later ended up in the Padua archives, described the following. When the lead cover was removed, steam escaped from inside. The fabric was intact. But the face was like the skin of a roasted animal. The eyes had disappeared, the tongue had fallen apart, and yet it seemed to me that the mouth was open wider than it should have been, as if he were breathing. 2 days after the opening, one of the soldiers committed suicide. Another died of fever. Conrad suffered a seizure. He lay unconscious for 3 days. When he regained consciousness, he issued a decree that the tomb be sealed forever, encased in iron, and that the gates be fumigated daily with sulfur. But the rumors did not subside. The ashes from the mausoleum began to be sold in the markets as a miracle cure for disease. People rubbed them on their skin, sprinkled them in their food, and put them under their pillows. Several people developed ulcers. One of the merchants was torn to pieces by a mob when a child who had swallowed the imperial powder died in agony. The trial is recorded in the Chronicles of the city of Bari. It says, "The ashes gave off a foul odor. They burned the tongue." The priest said, "This is not ashes, but a curse." Soon, a sect calling itself the Children of the Second Throne formed in northern Germany. Their prophet claimed that Frederick had only died in body, but his spirit had moved into an astronomical entity and now controlled events from beyond the earth. They were destroyed. But even a year after the emperor's death, his name could not be uttered in the temple. In one village, a woman was stoned to death for mentioning Frederick's name. In the third year after his death, a congress of princes gathered in Germany. It was decided to revise the imperial borders. Frederick's name was removed from official titles. Coins bearing his image were withdrawn. Coats of arms were painted over. All this was accompanied by fear. It was believed that if the image remained, so would the influence. Even educated people believed that the spirit of the deceased, who had rotted during his lifetime, could inhabit a book, a coin, or a seal. One of the few who dared to speak the truth was the monk Ruprecht of Mainz. He wrote, "The empire rotted along with his body, it became a shadow, we held on to fear, and now we hold on to lies. But rot does not go away if you close your eyes." I continue with the final, fourth part of the story. The finale is structured to reveal the ultimate consequences of Frederick II's death: political and religious decay, fear, attempts to whitewash his image, the consequences for his successors, the reaction of the people and the church, and the destruction of the foundations of society. The story will end in a clear and uncompromising manner, without lengthy epilogues, but with a distinct sense of historical catastrophe. 6 years after Frederick's death, his mausoleum in Salerno began to crumble. Plaster fell from the south side, revealing cracks in the limestone bricks beneath, as if something inside was pressing against the walls. Local monks appealed to the bishopric, but received no response. Then 3 of them, of their own accord, tried to surround the tomb with new masonry. One fell from the scaffolding and broke his neck. The second soon fell ill and died, and the third was struck by fever. After that, the work was stopped. It was believed that the mausoleum was protected by the very abomination left behind by the deceased. Conrad, the only remaining heir, had by that time already renounced part of his power. His letters became increasingly rare, and his orders increasingly vague. The Chronicle of the Monastery in Nuremberg notes, "The king writes, but does not speak. He has ordered silence about his father's death. He seems to fear words as he would a sword." Conrad himself subsequently fell ill. He began to suffer from stomach pains and mouth ulcers, and woke up in tears at night. The priest who cared for him said that this is the legacy of an unclean throne, passed down through blood and silence. Friedrich's former advisors either disappeared or were executed. Those who remained entered monasteries or fled to the Alps. The alchemist Abramo, whom the emperor himself called the guardian of the soul's salt, was found dead in a cave near Salerno. His face was disfigured and his tongue torn out. It was assumed that this was revenge by fanatics or the old nobility. According to witnesses, the following words were scratched on the wall: "He knew that the body was not dead." Upon receiving the final news of the destruction of the mausoleum, the Pope ordered the remains to be demolished. However, a group of pilgrims from northern France claimed that there was a grey pit on the site of the tomb, where it was impossible to breathe. 3 people died of suffocation. The rest fled. After that, by papal order, the site was fenced off with an iron chain and left for centuries as dead land. For a long time, the map of the Vatican marked this place as a lost point. Unrest continued in the cities. People refused to take communion in churches if Frederick was mentioned there. His name was a source of terror. In one of the schools in Bologna, teachers beat a student for drawing a man with a crown and empty eye sockets on the wall. Fear became a ritual. People fumigated their homes on the anniversary of his death. Mothers forbade their children from naming their sons after him Archival data show that by the 8th year after his death, the number of suicides among the lower clergy in Italy and Germany had risen sharply. This was explained by unrest caused by the decay of legitimate authority. In some parishes, people began to lose faith in the sacraments. One of the village priests burned the gospel in front of his parishioners, shouting, "If the accursed one rotted under the cross, then the cross does not save." He was later sentenced to death by burning, but by that time he had already died from poisoning his own blood. The emperor's influence finally disappeared a decade later. His name was removed from church documents, chronicles, and even inscriptions on coins. Heraldic symbols were replaced, and no subsequent monarch dared to take his titles in full. He was no longer the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He became a symbol of what should be avoided: superstition, pride, apostasy, and obsession with immortality. According to modern researchers, his body probably long ago turned to dust, but his burial place is still not recognized as sacred. Tourists do not go there. Residents avoid the area. To this day, in some parts of southern Italy, there is a popular superstition: if your heart hurts, don't go to the old emperor's tomb. It will stop. Frederick II died physically, but his death was not the end of life, but the beginning of the fear that the body is not a temple of the soul, but its trap. He was a symbol of intellectual power, enlightened authority, and a firm hand, but he passed away, surrounded by hawks, rags, sores, and the smell of dead flesh. Thus perished the man who wanted to become the new Caesar, but became a decaying corpse that consumed his own empire. The empire was no longer sacred. Rome was no longer united. People no longer believed in power or miracles. After the death of the emperor, whose flesh died before his soul, a new era dawned, an era in which death no longer meant silence, but only a rotting voice that could not be silenced.